Howdy boys, and welcome to Mr. East Classroom. In today's video we're going to be talking about some of the important events that happened in what's called the critical period. In class we left off with discussion about the ratification of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and sort of the birth of political factions and parties. And today we're going to look at what the first couple of administrations looked like and what sort of events America went through. So now we're going to take a look at what's called the critical period, or that time from about 1789 to 1800. It's also called the Federal Era. And the reason for that is that the people who occupy real leadership roles are all people who were interested in expanding the federal power and who actually participated in writing the Constitution. Most of them will be Federalists, not all of them. But so in this period we'll see a sort of pendulum swing towards federal power and just sort of the early formation of government under the Constitution as opposed to the very loose, weak Articles of Confederation. The figure I've chosen here for this front slide is President George Washington, who we'll look at in a moment. But the reason for that is that he's going to be president for most of the critical period. And most people will agree that really his leadership and even just his symbolic presence were very important to keeping the nation united. Looking at political parties and stuff, you know, there was a real chance, even after the Constitution, that the nation could fall apart. There was no promise that we would get sort of regular functioning governing institutions. And he's the guy who sets a lot of that in motion. He's the guy who's going to set a lot of our basic precedents for government. And that's why he's here. The other president in this time will be John Adams, and we'll see with his presidency why he's not chosen to be the front piece. So, with the Constitution ratified and everything in place, it's time to actually elect government. Okay, so by the end of 1788 into 1789, we're going to have our first set of elections for the federal government to fill all those nice branches that were laid out in the Constitution. Obviously, the big and central one is going to be the presidential election, but they'll also elect members to Congress, and we'll look at the Supreme Court later. Now, you may have heard it before. I heard it in school, okay, that Washington was elected unanimously, okay? And thinking in modern terms, it would be very miraculous if anyone was elected unanimously, that everyone in the country voted for one guy. That's not exactly how it happened, although he was elected more or less unanimously. So, and we've talked about the Electoral College, but all of the electors, okay, remember, not people, cast at least one vote for George Washington. At least of those states that voted. A couple, because they couldn't get their act together, weren't in time to actually vote. Rhode Island had not yet formally joined the Union. But all electors cast a vote, and all popular votes that were cast in the very few states that had popular votes did vote for Washington. He was kind of the presumptive pick. Why was Washington such an attractive option that everyone was willing to vote for him? Well, the big leading point, a key point of his generalship during the Revolution, is that he had all the power. He was commander-in-chief, very well respected, and then at the end of the war, he gave it up. And that was an important thing for people living in a Republican government, right, a representative government, that someone was willing to give up power instead of pursue it. There's a real worry that he might have become a king, and he chose not to do so. Second was Washington was very firmly and proudly independent of faction. He did not give in to too much factionalism. If he leaned in one direction, it was in the Federalist direction, but Washington's a man of the land, okay? He's a farmer, or a plantation owner. A farmer would be kind of working the land yourself. But he leans Federalist, but generally is not partisan. His primary concern is having a strong, successful nation. One thing to note is that only a few states have popular votes at this time. So total, the people who vote in the first presidential election is about 40,000. And of those, they vote for Washington, or vote for electors who will vote for Washington. Remember, it's electors who actually cast the votes, even today, and each state chose how its electors were appointed. At this time, most electors are chosen by state legislatures, not popular votes. Okay, it's Republican, not Democratic. And so that's how he gets a unanimous vote. Remember, also we talked about the early electoral college in class. Electors at this time cast 2 separate votes, and the guy who gets the most votes is president, and the person who receives the second most votes is vice president. It's not how it works today, and very quickly this system ran into trouble. But on this first election, they went through with it, and so John Adams will come in second and be vice president. A keynote: Washington will be re-elected in 1792 by all the states, and again will win a unanimous re-election. But so, just a few months after signing off as a nation on the new governing document, the nation also signs off on Washington as the first president to lead that government. So Washington and the first presidential administration. It's going to last from about 1789 to 1797. Remember, presidential elections are held on even years every 4 years, so he was elected in 1788. But presidents aren't inaugurated, until the start of the next year. At this time it was in March. Now it's moved to January, but that happened later. So whenever he's elected, he's actually going to be inaugurated in New York City, which was the very first national capital. Very quickly it'll be moved to Philadelphia and later Washington, D.C. But so he's inaugurated in New York City, and this is vaguely what it looked like where he was sworn in. And he chose to be sworn in on a Bible, which is what set up that tradition. And then gave an inaugural address. He set up most of our early precedents for what presidents are supposed to do, and he sort of characterized what the presidential tone was supposed to be. He didn't, at least publicly, get involved in factionalistic fights. He tried to be above the fray. But again, as a sort of central figure, he will be a figure everyone in the nation, despite their differences, can agree on. And that'll help keep things working. One example of a precedent he sets is that he chooses to only serve for 2 terms, which creates an unwritten rule. Later people will try and win 3rd terms, and actually FDR is going to win 4 terms. But generally speaking, that's a faux pas, and Washington will create that standard. Again, he is independent of party, but if he had to lean in one direction, it's probably towards the Federalists. Some key positions, John Adams is his vice president, and John Adams will remark, as many other vice presidents have since, that it is the most useless office ever created. He hardly does anything and is really just a presidential understudy. John Jay, for what it's worth, will be appointed the first Chief Justice and help fill out that role. And John Jay was also an important diplomat, and later, I believe, Secretary of State. So he's going to, and this is important, draw the members of his cabinet, and a cabinet is sort of the members of a president's inner circle who head important departments, like the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of State, the State Department, the War Department, or the military, and now it's the Department of Defense, the Treasury. Departments like that are headed by a secretary, and those secretaries make up a president's cabinet. What Washington will choose to do is pick people from all different sorts of groups and factions, the idea being to preserve it, to create a truly national government, and not one based on section or faction. In a big way, Washington's government is a kind of A-team, or an A-list of important founding figures. Ben Franklin's even in there as Postmaster General. And of those 2 members in the cabinet who are really important and who will create a really sort of divisive environment is going to be Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, later President Jefferson, who will be Secretary of State. An important thing about both figures is that both were the leaders of 2 opposite political factions, later to become political parties. Hamilton is the leader, or at least one of the leaders, of the Federalists, And Jefferson is the leader of the Democratic Republicans, at the time just called Republicans, but for convenience we'll call them Democratic Republicans. And they had very opposing views about what the country should look like. We talked about this a bit in class, But to have these guys working in an administration together at two such important posts was bound to cause trouble, and it did. They couldn't share the same office space, and eventually Jefferson's actually going to leave the administration and run in opposition. But at first they lead to a lot of interesting debates about what the future of government will be. Jefferson's sort of agrarian democratic vision will lose in the short term, though it'll resurge later. And Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, will really be sort of the star worker, the sort of wonder kid, although he's not a kid anymore, of Washington's administration. The key figure, kind of the wonder boy, although he's not a boy anymore, in Washington's administration that's going to help create almost as many precedents as Washington does, is Hamilton. And Hamilton's going to have a grand plan for the economy. Okay, specifically, he has a plan to unite and strengthen the nation through economic means. Okay, remember, Hamilton is a federalist. Hamilton likes energetic, strong government, and that's what he's going to seek. Okay, he has three basic points that he wants to address in order to turn the nation's economy around. Remember, coming out of the 1780s, things are looking pretty bad. Everyone's got debt. It's all disorganized. The government's weak, or appears to be weak, and he wants to put all of those things to right. Historians have generally been pretty kind to Hamilton. Not everyone is so kind. I'm kind of moderate either way. But his three big points is going to be that he's going to want to refinance the nation's debt. Okay. One thing I want to do is assume, and this is interesting, assume the state debts, or have the federal government assume all state debts. Now this is kind of weird, but what it means is that all the debts that the various states owe, the federal government's just going to write them a check for it and take on the debt itself. The point of that, in Hamilton's mind, is that one, it'll start everyone on a clean slate. Two, it'll attach all sort of financial interest on the national scene and away from the divided states. And basically, those states owed money to people, including American people, powerful Americans. And the idea would be that if the federal government was responsible for paying back that debt, then wealthy people would want the federal government to succeed. And so he wants to sort of concentrate the interest of powerful people away from state success and towards the national success. He's also going to issue bonds. Now all a bond is, whether you've heard of it or not, is basically a loan, a low interest loan given by the government, or rather taken by the government, I should say. So a private investor or a bank or someone will basically give the government money up front for it to pay for things, and then gradually it will pay that money back with some amount of interest to the bond holder. In this way, Hamilton would get money in the short term to pay off national debt, and he'd also give wealthy people an interest in the national government, and then that way they would want it to succeed. Hamilton's actually going to be sort of a creative, inventive user of debt, and will manage it very deftly. Second, or lastly, in the refinancing of debt, he's going to raise taxes. And this is something the article governments couldn't do, but that the new constitutional federal government can do, is raise taxes. And he'll raise many excise taxes, or taxes on luxury goods. But the big famous tax that he raises is a heavy tax on whiskey. Okay? We'll talk about that in a bit, but that's going to irritate a lot of farmers out in sort of the woods in the West, especially in Pennsylvania. But so Hamilton's going to be our tax guy, our money guy. Another thing that he has is he's going to want to charter a national bank to stabilize and centralize the economy. This is controversial. As we've talked about, Jeffersonians do not want a national bank. They don't trust banks. They think it's a means of sort of oligarchical control. But Hamilton thinks banks are going to be necessary if you're going to have a commercial society. And the nation at the time only has like 3 major banks, and that's not enough to run a nation that large. So he wants a big one where the government can store its money, they can lend money to the government, and basically just centralize all commerce with one bank in New York. Which will generally contribute to New York becoming a financial center for the country. In order to get this, though, he's going to have to actually make a compromise with people, with the Jeffersonians, with the Democratic Republicans. and that will be the Great Compromise of 1790. And in that compromise, what they'll actually agree to do is first move the federal capital to Pennsylvania, away from New York, and then eventually to Washington, D.C., in the South, or what was the South then, for him to get his national bank. So that's one of the first big political deals that's made after the Constitution, and it's why Washington, D.C. is the capital. Lastly, he's going to want to encourage manufacturing and commerce with tariffs and bounties. A tariff, as we know, is a tax on imported goods. So by prohibiting or making imported goods more expensive, he wants to encourage manufacturing in America. And a bounty is basically just whenever you pay someone a reward for either inventing a new thing or manufacturing goods. It's not something we really do too much today, although tariffs are coming back. Now, he doesn't really achieve that in his life. The Jeffersonians and Democratic Republicans shoot it down, but later people will take up the same sort of thing. So this is his vision for the national economy. It's commerce-based, it's capitalism-based, and this is his basic outlay for the plan. Not everything was finance-based, however, and many events went on in Washington's presidency that didn't have too much to do with Hamilton, okay? Although much was linked to Hamilton. In part, the economy is generally going to improve, stabilize, and eventually prosper. Hamilton's plan, to many people, is going to seem to work, although many people will be skeptical of parts of it. But generally what Washington's able to do is encourage real confidence in the national government, and both foreign and domestic. So people at home are going to feel better about the government, and foreign governments will actually look to America as sort of an up-and-coming, stronger nation. One problem, Hamilton's taxes have irritated a lot of farmers, and so we'll actually have the Whiskey Rebellion. Kind of like Shays' Rebellion, except for different causes. Rural Pennsylvanians, who are large manufacturers or makers of whiskey, they turn their corn crops into whiskey to sell it, and the tax is really hurting them, and they're actually going to revolt and try and reject the tax. Unlike in Shays' Rebellion, where Massachusetts had to deal with it, the Army, the federal Army, is going to get called out, and George Washington, and I think Alexander Hamilton will come with him, but he'll lead the Army himself. And this is the only time a sitting president has actually led the Army himself. And Washington will go, and generally the rebellion flees in the face of his military force, but it puts a lot of confidence in the national government, but it also kind of gives some rural people, some farmers, second thoughts about all this power in the government. Lastly, there is the French Revolution going on at this time, and that's sort of the big foreign spectacle. And generally, as we talked about with political parties, different parties will favor different sides, so whether Britain or France in the struggle. Washington, what he's going to try and do is stay out of all of it. He doesn't want to get involved in too much of those foreign problems. And generally keeping us out of that war is going to help us overall. So while there's a lot of factional struggle, strife, and difficulties going on during Washington's presidency, there's also some good things, okay? His leadership will keep the nation together despite all the partisan tensions, and really help the nation to get off its feet in the early days. All things must come to an end, however, and likewise Washington will eventually not be president, okay? Famously, he declines to run for a third term. He's had enough, he thinks he's served long enough, and he will retire, and that will sort of set up the precedent of only 2 terms. So he's left the nation in pretty good shape, but famously he finishes with a farewell address to the nation. And what's important is this farewell address actually used to be read aloud in Congress every year for about 100 years after the event. We don't read it anymore, and you will probably see why. There's a lot of good stuff in this address, but 2 points I want to emphasize to you, and he warns the American people of this. Okay, the first warning is to avoid faction, focus on the nation. He thinks that divisive factions and parties will tear the nation apart and destroy the nation. Now, this warning is dismissed immediately. As we'll see, partisan tension goes off the charts immediately, and it's been with us more or less ever since. But a second warning is very important and very relevant, and that is to avoid foreign entanglements, foreign alliances, and problems. What Washington will say is basically the great benefit of America is that we happen to be removed from Europe and foreign problems. What we ought to do is stay out of those problems and let them handle it themselves. And so actually, from the end of the Revolution up until World War II, America will have no permanent foreign military alliances. Now we are involved in maybe over 100 vague guarantees and alliances. But that one message at least will shape American foreign policy for at least a century going forward. And that's Washington's sort of final legacy. He will go home to Mount Vernon and die just a couple of years after leaving office, where he will write a promise to free his slaves, at least upon the death of his wife, Martha, which of course is not immediate emancipation or anything like that, but it is unusual of Southern planters to do that at this time. Lastly, to round out the critical period, we have the presidency of John Adams, which will only be one term. He does not win a second term. Adams will also not win a unanimous victory. At this time, we'll look at it maybe in class, parties have not agreed on just having one nominee, so parties will sometimes have multiple presidential nominees. The result is you can easily split votes, electoral votes, this way. Adams will come out on top during a very ugly election between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Adams is a Federalist, and so that's the first successor administration. And he will govern in some ways like Washington, but maybe with less style and being much less liked. His major achievement really is to build up the Navy. Those we'll see Thomas Jefferson tear that all down. But really his administration is going to get overshadowed by foreign affairs, and that's a big thing to focus on. The war between Britain and France and really all of Europe is still going on. Many people, like Alexander Hamilton, want Adams to enter the war on the side of Britain. Other people want him to enter the war on the side of France. And what Adams is going to do, much to his credit, though he's often poo-pooed by many people, is he'll choose to stay out of the war. And actually, because he chooses to stay out of the war, Hamilton will break with him, and the result will be that the Federalists will split and totally lose in the next election. We'll talk on that later. But one legacy you should remember about him, is that the Alien and Sedition Acts take place during his administration. And what those did was they put limits, strong limits, on immigration and how long it took for an immigrant to become a citizen. They're worried about radicals coming from France and Europe, becoming citizens and overtaking the U.S. government. So this will put restrictions on immigration, more or less. And the Sedition Act is very controversial. The Alien Act wasn't that controversial, but the Sedition Act made it illegal basically to criticize much of the federal government and the president. It was very seldom actually exercised, but it's criticized then and criticized now as basically an administration trying to pass laws to punish political opponents. And it will eventually expire. But so generally acts like that, sedition acts in particular, will be frowned upon. That does not mean that they won't come back. They will come back. But that's how we're going to round out the end of the federal era. With Adams, Washington had big shoes to fill, and it's unlikely that anyone could have filled those boots satisfactorily. Adams, a smart man, an honest patriot, but was not able to live up to it, and was really not a great politician generally. Much better suited for diplomatic or intellectual works, not the works of sort of leadership, really. But nevertheless, with him, we have the end of an era and a nation that has survived, but a nation that is also on the brink of a very divisive and vicious election, which we will discuss in class. Until then, have a great afternoon.